I don't think I was on the bench 2 weeks before this young woman came into my courtroom. The request was to send her to the juvenile prison, Copper Lake. The young woman had been through so much. I had just taken all of my time making sure that I knew about her case, about what she had been through. Her mother had been killed, her father had abused her, and she had grown up in the system, and she was at an age where she wasn't a cute child anymore. And so the only result that they felt was appropriate for her was to send her to the juvenile prison. And as a new person sitting on the bench, I was intrigued because this made absolutely no sense to me, because this child had not done anything to warrant her to be in a juvenile prison institution. Yes, she had a bad attitude, and yes, she could be snappy and snippy at people, and no, she was not always fun to get along with, but she didn't deserve to be incarcerated. She didn't deserve to miss prom. She didn't deserve to miss her first date. She had done nothing to deserve to be incarcerated. So when I refused to send her to a prison, I started asking myself, what do I do with a child that nobody wants? No one from her family wanted her. No one in the system wanted her. They wanted to put her away into a black hole called prison and then forget about her and let her figure out what she's supposed to do with her life. That's not the judge I wanted to be, so I refused to do that. But that case introduced me to the world of juvenile justice here in Dane County. I had taken on the bench, and I started to be introduced to a lot of children who had been through so much pain. They had suffered sexual abuse and physical abuse. They had been neglected. They had lost their fathers and mothers and support systems, and here they were before me in court, and we were trying to figure out what is the best way, what is the fair way, what is the just way to ensure that these children find a place in this court process that seems fair, kind, and loving. So as a new judge, I said, well, they told me that I could control what was in my courtroom. I said, okay, well, that sounds very interesting. You mean I have control over everything inside my courtroom? They were like, yes, you have control over everything that comes inside my courtroom. So I said, well, the first thing I want to do is take the handcuffs off these children, because I could not believe that in modern day Wisconsin, that we were still handcuffing children who were coming into courtrooms. And it didn't matter why they were coming into courtroom. If they were coming from our juvenile detention center, they were automatically shackled with their hands, and they were put in shackles. And so when I saw that, I started saying, how is it that we're trying to be a trauma-informed community, but they're choosing to put handcuffs on women, young girls that are experiencing sexual trafficking, and that's what brought them into us. I said, if we're going to be different, we cannot look like the person who just trafficked her. And the person who just trafficked her put restraints and belts and ropes around her wrists. I said, no, we're not going to keep handcuffs on these children. We're going to take them off. Now, I must tell you that my timing probably wasn't the best. Maybe after being on a job for just 2 months, that might not have been the best thing to do. But I felt like if I was elected, I was elected for a reason. I was elected to ensure that those people, those young people who come before me, find fairness in the process of being there in court. And so I said, let's take the handcuffs off. And eventually I was able to convince the other judges with our presiding judge, Shelley Gaylord, to be able to get these handcuffs off the children, to change the presumption from presuming that they must be handcuffed to changing the presumption to saying they should be presumed to be free unless there's any other reason to put restraints on them. And I think fundamentally what I have chosen to bring to the bench is the idea that a lot of our children need to know that the court system, that the courtroom can be a fair place, that it can be a balanced place, and I had to have the courage to be able to say, no longer is this an okay practice. And so every day I would go into court and I would just experience all these different things about how the young people were experiencing their life. I mean, the court system said it was trauma-informed, but all of the practices were not. A lot of the young people would come into court and adults would just dump on every bad thing that the child had ever done. The social worker would dump, the DA would dump, even sometimes their own attorney would dump on them. And I started saying to myself, like, how is this fair? This is not fair that these young people are never given anything positive to be said about them. We would also experience young people who were just homeless and alone. I had never thought in a community that I would ever see children who were alone. And by alone, I mean there was no mother, There was no father, there was no grandmother, no support system. There was no one to be able to be there, to be that support for that young person when they came into court. If you had told me that before I took the bench that I would ever see that, I'd be like, no, not in Dane County, not in Madison, not in this state of Wisconsin. We wouldn't see that. But every day I would take the bench and I would see a young person sitting at counsel table with nothing but a defense attorney and nobody else in the courtroom. In fact, some children I wanted to return back from Lincoln Hills. I had one young man that I was adamantly ready to bring him back into the courtroom, and every time I brought him back for Lincoln Hills, nobody showed up to take him. Nobody. So for month after month after month, I would bring him back from Lincoln Hills with the intended purpose to transfer him back to his home so he could get into a different setting. It didn't happen, and eventually I had to go get his mother and go get family in order for somebody to show up because he didn't deserve to be at Lincoln Hills anymore. So being in the juvenile rotation is really about trying to figure out how do we stop what I think is the most pervasive and most traumatic situation that is happening before us. I know we talk a lot about school to prison pipeline, but after being on the bench for over 2 years, the pipeline that is most devastating to me is the child welfare, the juvenile delinquency to adult prison pipeline. And that pipeline passes traumatized children from one system to the next. And as these children are moved from one system to the next, their trauma is worsened rather than it gets better. So sometimes I have had children who are moved over 39 times from one placement to the next. They say one move is traumatic. Can you imagine 39 different moves? And so we're trying to figure out how do we make sure that these children are not moved from one place to the next? How do we break the pipeline so that one child here, one child here, one child here doesn't end up fully incarcerated and end up in places where they never have an option for their future? The only way I found out to start breaking this pipeline, I had to start listening to the kids. Now I tell you, once you start letting kids talk in court, they don't ever want to shut up. They feel like they have been holding this in for years and they are ready at this moment to just, yes, judge, this is what's going on. And I started and so the adults would get frustrated with me because they would say, this kid is talking too much. I said, listen, I have multiple degrees from multiple institutions. If you want to say something to me, write it. I'll read it before court, but I promise you, you're not going to say anything negative about this kid, and I'm going to let this kid talk. I want to hear from them. I want to hear their stories. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what they're fighting against. I want to know what they're struggling against. And when I started letting the children talk, they started giving me indications that we're living in real bad, unjust systems with these children. And so I had one young girl, she had been homeless, and she was living from couch to couch, and she wanted to go to school. So she came into court and she said, Judge, I want to go to school. I said, what do you mean you want to go to school? I said, surely you should want to go to school. I want you to go to school. Let's advocate for you to go to school. And she said, but they won't let me in school. I said, this is America. Nobody's going to tell you you can't go to school. If you want to go to school, you can go to school. She said, no, Your Honor, I can't go to school. They won't let me in the building. They told me I can't do a full day. They told me I can't do this. I said, no, sweetheart, that cannot be the case. Let's work on this. I'm ordering the department. Go make sure you talk to the school system. Go make sure you talk to the people. Attorney, go talk to them. We'll be back here next week. We got to get this baby in school. Next week happens. They denied her coming into school. Now, by this time, I'm very upset because I can't quite understand why this child isn't allowed to go into school. And so then we come back into court, and then she says, well, I have an IEP, but I have a shortened school day. And I said, what is a shortened school day? They said, well, a shortened school day is when you only go to school for an hour and a half to 2 hours a day, and it may not be in the school building and where you're going. I said, you only go to school, if you're allowed to go to school, an hour and a half to 2 hours a day? How long you been doing this? She said, since middle school. I said, that's a problem. I said, well, let's have another hearing and we figure this out. While I was waiting on that hearing, I started having more hearings with my kids, and I started asking them, when do you go to school? When do you go to school? How long are you in school? And kid after kid after kid after kid after kid found out that they were not even in school. They were only going to school an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours a day, at most 2 hours a day, and they were not being given the same education as other kids. All of our court-ordered black, brown, and low-income white children were not being allowed to go into schools because the school system had determined, because they had behavioral issues, that they could not handle full-day school. I had one child, she was trying her best to go to school, and because she couldn't go to school, she decided to go get a job. And I said, you got a job? She said, yes, Your Honor, because I don't want to go back to jail. I don't want to end up in these institutions, so I got a job. I said, well, tell me about your job. She said, well, I work 8 hours at KFC, and I go to school for an hour and a half. I said, you do what? She said, yeah, I work 8 hours at KFC, and I go to school for an hour and a half. So I looked at the social worker and the other people in the room. I said, you going to tell me that this child can handle 8 hours at KFC, taking orders of fried chicken all day long, but she can't handle school? I said, we have a problem here. We have a problem. And because I am a judge, I chose to use my power to assist the children who did not have the power and their families. And I said, if I don't get a resolution, I'm going to file a complaint because this is not fair. Come to find out, after we did work with the school district and work with DPI, and I was grateful that my wife, Dr. Everett Mitchell, who's also a law school grad, was there to assist me in being able to understand this process around special education, IEPs. And come to find out that these black and brown court-ordered children had been put in shortened school days for over 20 years. 20 years. Now, as a person who believes in education, who's passionate about education, it behooves me to hear that our children had been treated like this. And I said to myself, I should not have been the first one to raise the alarm that this is not fair that these children are being treated like this. But I did, and we sat down with the school district, and we tried to come up, and we're coming up constantly with a better process for these children. But it just underscored the injustice and the unfairness that they have felt when they try to exercise who they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be. I told these young people, and I do this often, I'll sit down with them as we're talking about these systemic injustices, and I'll tell them, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. This is not how you are supposed to be treated. This is not how the system is supposed to work. But I promise you, as long as I'm sitting here on this bench and you up under my jurisdiction, I'm going to make sure that these systems give you exactly what you need. Because I recognize that if they are not given the option of education, and if they are not given the things that they need, there's only one option for their future. That is incarceration. And we cannot sit by and allow those things to happen. So I do all kinds of unconventional stuff in my courtroom because I just believe I want to hear the kids. The other day, one of my young low-income white children, he came into the courtroom and he was just like, yo, Judge, I got a rap and I want to be a rapper. And he started giving me his rap and I'm just like, all right, that sounds real good. He's like, you think so, Judge? Now, I'll be honest with you, it wasn't my favorite rap, but he was so excited that he was doing something. He drew me some pictures. He had taken time to give me some stuff. I have children who draw me art. I have children who do origami to show their appreciation that I have allowed their voices to be heard. This is important to me because I really recognize that maybe that if we share and show them just ways of being that will transform their lives so they can believe that the systems that we say can be fair are fair, that they are just, that they are right, and that these children will be given the chances that they need to be successful. I believe that. I live that out and I fight that. I fight for that every day. So often I'm asked, why do you fight the way you do? Why do you invite these children to participate in ways that you do? And I say to a lot of the people who question my process, I say I do that because I am just like them. See, a part of my story is this. I grew up a fatherless child. I didn't know my father. My sister Chantal had experienced years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, and we couldn't get no help. For over 12 years, we couldn't get someone to call the police, to call for help, to get this man out of our home so we could be safe. So Because I experienced that for so long, for so many years, education was not at the forefront of my mind. And so I'd done a lot of work to try to get my sister help and wouldn't help her. And then I had experienced it myself from babysitters, and I couldn't get help, and we couldn't get help. And because we couldn't get help, I remember the clear moment when I recognized that I'm about to be a graduate senior, but I barely can read, and I can't tell nobody that I can't read. So when I got ready to graduate from high school, after telling a teacher the story, she called CPS, and it was the first time in all those years that we had finally got some help. But by that time, I realized I had missed something very important. I recognize that now I am a judge. I recognize that I am here in this position, and the reason why I'm here in this position is because people kept helping me along the way. I'm not here because I was the best student. I'm not here because I was the best athlete or I came from the best family or community. I was just a poor little black kid who had experienced pain and trauma, and I needed help, and there were people along the way to give me the help that I needed. I remember Ma Bell and Miss Wilson when I went to college for the first time, and I was so confused. I was failing everything. And Miss Wilson grabbed me one day while walking down the hall, and she said, "Everett, you are a diamond in the rough." And I said, "A diamond in the rough?" I didn't even know what she was talking about. But she said, "You're special." And she said, "I know you're struggling, but I'm going to help you because I see greatness. I see you can be these things." And I couldn't do it. I couldn't understand things. But she said, if you just work hard, keep pushing, don't give up on yourself, we will make this work out. It will work out. And every day, even though I didn't know how to study, I went up to the library and I sat in that library from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. every night with my big old boom box sitting on my shoulder. And I went there and I said, I'm going to try my best. And I kept working. I kept working hard. And every step along the way, somebody was always there to give me exactly what I needed. So this is every day I sit on the bench. That's what I give to these children. I tell these children, I'm not your judge. I know the nameplate in front of me says Judge Everett Mitchell. I'm not your judge. I'm your reflection. Because I made it, and I promise you, you will make it too. You will overcome this. One of my kids, he was like one of these kids that everybody felt so afraid of. He had been so traumatized by the age of 2, nobody even knew what to do with this kid or how to help this kid. And so one day, all of the sheriffs were around him, and they were surrounding him because they were afraid that he was going to do something bad. And so I said to him, and he was locked in restraints and all this, and I brought him into court, and I said, this is not who you are. I said, you give me what I need. Give me the evidence that I need. Control who you are. Don't be angry. Don't act out. Control it. I'll see you next week, and we're going to build, and we're going to make sure that these people see who you really are, not who they think you are. They think you're dangerous. I think you're great. Let me prove me right to show you great. So next week came into court. He had a better week. So I had stopped over at Walgreens or something, and I was getting some fidget spinners from a kid. So I picked up a fidget spinner for this kid, and we had the hearing. And he said, Your Honor, I'm trying to hold on. I said, you know what? I stopped by the store. I got you this fidget spinner. Every time you get upset, I want you to take this fidget spinner, and I want you to spin it, all right? I want you to hit it and spin it. And then next week, we're going to come back to court. I'm going to see how you're doing, and we're going to work this thing out. That next week, he came back to court. He had a decent week, came into court, and he had that fidget spinner. It was broken. I said, how many times you hit that fidget spinner? He said, man, you said every time I got upset, and I just kept hitting it. And so I told him, I said, all right, man, you know what? Luckily, I ordered you a special fidget spinner, one more advanced that won't break, and I gave that to him, and he kept spinning. And one day he got upset, and they were like, this boy is beyond control. We can't control him. So I got off the bench. I took my robe off. I told him to come here. I put the robe on him. We zipped up the robe. I said, go sit on the bench. We sat on the bench, and I made everybody look at him, and I said, this is who you are. This is your future. Remember what I told you. I'm not your judge. I'm your reflection. Because everybody around here may think you don't have the strength to do it, but I need you to hear one voice with power that believes that you have the capacity to do it. I even let him hit my gavel. Took him out there, put my robe back on. He hasn't been back since. I often believe this is the joy I have every day, is to give hope to children and families that everybody else may not want to give that hope to. And I hope that I've answered my own question. What do I do with a child nobody wants? Love them. What do I do with a child nobody wants? Hug them. What do I do with a child nobody wants? Believe in them. What do I do with a child nobody wants? Give them a chance for their second chance. Thank y'all so much.